Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Evolutionary Stasis series. So last episode we discussed why coelacanth in particular, as well as some other animals, do not have morphological stability within their own kind and thus no stasis. While a creationist would argue that all variation within kind is stasis, the point is that the amount of variation within what they would consider stasis is larger than the variation between supposedly separate kinds. This truth is demonstrated by the creationist method of taxon correlation, where any clusters that have less distance between them than within themselves, that means that they're part of a large cluster of related organisms. The problem for creationists is that this method can be used to demonstrate that birds are dinosaurs, and it only gets worse with more fossil discoveries that keep bridging the gaps. Today's main subject, snakes, similarly display a clear lack of stasis. They have a ton of diversity of form within their shared traits. For some reason, creationists call all of these snakes, but refuse to say why God would be so lazy as to repeat the same creation over and over and over again when the only differences are minor, though the range is vast. Creationists claim that there are 41 separate snake kinds and one cat kind. Weird that God would love the snake form so much that he repeated it 41 separate times. At least, that's not even counting all of those he separately created just to be drowned in the flood. But why call these all snakes if they are just as related as a human and a pine tree are? For example, what are creationists using to decide that this tentacle snake didn't evolve its tentacles? Nothing. Merely the axiom that biblical evolution cannot create, only change the regulation of existing traits. But this takes absolute ignorance of how biochemistry actually works. Differently shaped bones or skin appendages typically only take minor tweaks to regulation of existing skin, scale, or bone genes. Location and magnitude of the traits are accepted as mutable in the creationist understanding, but what they don't understand is that actually justifies the growth of ostensibly new traits. In the case of this snake, regulating more skin to grow in a particular area can create elongated parts of the skin, and regulation can also cause it to have more nerve density, and boom, they have a new sense organ. No actually new structures, just pinched off skin and more nerve density, all from existing structures. Nothing about the tentacled snake separates it conclusively from other snakes, nor do creationists explain why they would separate so many snake kinds. Snakes in particular show the astounding variety of scale shapes and how primitive rigid feathers could form from the leaf-shaped scales, as seen in fossils like Longosquama, Cosasaurus, Confuciusornis, and other reptile and bird animals. Flying snakes flatten themselves in effect if you use their whole body and scales as a single feather. While these guys clearly show that a single body plan is not locked to a certain form or function, I'm going to cover the flying snakes separately, so we'll get to them later. Back to stasis. Sometimes we must look at internal structures as well. Burrowing snakes have a larger chamber in their inner ear bones. Would God have separately created these slightly larger ear bones for different snakes, or is it more likely that some snakes just microevolved larger or smaller vestibules in their inner ear to adapt to different lifestyles? Snakes are a great example of macroevolution because it's clear they're derived from tetrapod plants, going from four-legged reptiles to slithering ones. Some snakes have hip and leg bones as well as claws. These are clearly vestigial limbs that no longer serve the function of limbs. Snakes are in the process of changing their morphology right now since they still have these vestiges. The creationist excuse is that they need hips to breed, but not all snakes have them, so that's bunk. And any created use for these external claws does not require the internal bones homologous to hips and legs, and it doesn't require them to be in the location between the torso and the tail either. An efficient design would do away with such unnecessary parts, especially if the creation is supposed to serve as a standing evidence against evolution. Clearly, snake-like forms do not need these vestigial features for any particular reason, and we have transitional fossils showing snakes in varying degrees of leg loss, and we find snakes with little more than toenails left of legs, with ultimately unnecessary internal parts that sit exactly on a place of the skeleton where in other animals is the junction between torso and tail. That's exclusively concordant with modification with descent and makes no sense under a lens of intelligent design because it's inconsistently applied and thus is an apparently useless hypothesis. Using the evidence of vestiges and knowledge of geology, we found snake fossils with full legs, making evolution a useful theory. Since every form is transitional, there will be vestiges. There's no reason for these bones to exist under a creationist model. The excuse is usually that vestiges do or could have a useful function. These excuses break down because vestiges aren't claimed to have no function, just a changed function. which would be Macroevolution 1, and 2, if created by intelligence, these functions could be performed by other structures, or aren't needed in similar life forms. Instead, we see that they're made from parts that exist in transitional forms in similar species, and are unnecessary in similar species. Why would God limit his creation to follow the evolutionary pattern? Why would he do this other than to make us believe in evolution? Having a function does not mean that function is necessary to the design, and if it shares homology with other parts, especially if we have specimens that appear transitional, then it is far more likely that this trait was inherited. In the case of snakes, they even appear at the junction of torso and tail, where legs would be if the snake's spurs were inherited. These are clearly leftovers of functional limbs, but creationists try to distract and hand-wave this evidence of macroevolution due to the structures clearly being inherited from limbs not designed for mating. These two are going at it, and they have no spurs at all. How romantical. Doesn't seem like these guys are using their spurs very much. They're hard to see, but they are mating pythons with spurs. They're just mating like normal snakes without spurs do. They can hold onto each other just fine without them. In fact, most snake species do this. Yet creationists insist that God intervened and gave them to some snakes to aid in breeding, even though they don't need them at all. Creationists say that they're designed because they're functional in mating, which they say is all about gripping one another, even though they can do this without the spurs. Do these look necessary for mating? They're actually described in the literature as used by the males for poking and prodding as a way of foreplay, not gripping apparatus. But again, most snake species get along fine without these at all, so they just aren't necessary design elements. They can be used in combat to scratch one another, which is why just a single toe is preserved, rather than a designed gripping apparatus. But again, it's absurd to think that God decided most snakes just didn't need this at all. It's explained far better by inheritance, since a designer would make something more efficient and consistent, yet it's restricted to parts that exist in the previous generations and locations that solely indicate inherited origins. Instead, they're likely only to be near the genitals because they were modified from hind legs. I've had multiple creationists snicker about what a snake with half a leg or shrunken legs would look like. It's so sad that these people haven't been exposed to real paleontology. Well, here you go, scoffers, we have the fossils. Transitional forms show snakes were not always legless. This is a snake, with legs. The previous excuse for hip and leg bones in snakes does not apply, as these are not just some internal bone remnants from muscle anchors or tiny spurs, they are fully external articulated legs and feet, and yet they're on the body of a snake that can slither. And in the same location as the bone spurs between torso and tail, they're clearly not functional as legs, perhaps as fins at the most, and yet they have the structure of fully formed limbs, just shrunken. We know that there are snakes out there who do not need these legs, whether they burrow, they slither, or swim, and they aren't necessary for mating. So this would either be a supremely odd aesthetic choice that God made, knowing it would give ammunition to evolution, or it's the product of evolution. So either your God is an idiot or doesn't exist, as usual. Actually, this snake's legs would be perfect for gripping during sex, but God drowned them all, so I guess they didn't make it onto the ark, so we can't study their mating behaviors. The first excuse creationists give is that some of the fossils found have stubs and not full legs, trying to sweep fully legged snakes under the rug. The liars at AIG want their followers to just believe them, but the actual truth is evidently the exact opposite of their claims, as usual. They mention that yes, there are bony spurs, which indicates evolution, but they deliberately fail to mention the specimens that do have fully formed limbs. Of course, the creationists deliberately avoid or misrepresent specimens like this Tetrapodophis because it's better to keep their followers in ignorance of the actual range of natural variation. Again, we know these are snakes the same way AIG knows Pachyrhacus is a snake by its skull. Now, why would a snake lose its legs? Well, that's mainly going to be the subject of next video, where we'll be able to study animals where it's happening to in real time. But snakes probably just didn't need their limbs anymore for locomotion, since slithering works just fine. But if they were designed like this as paddles, since this was a swimming snake, why is God using the skeleton design of lizard feet and not, say, the flipper design of whales or the flippers of penguins? Inconsistent designs that are derivative of homologous structures in very similar and older animals are exclusively indicative of inheritance. Would creationists consider a long, thin, but four-legged reptile population transitioning into a legless reptile population to be macroevolution? Creationist institutes actually do admit that this kind of evolution is possible. Quote, from a creationary perspective, this hypothesis is possible in that the idea of losing features through natural processes is within the realm of biblical worldview of creation and the fall. Loss of limbs has also been correlated with changes in the expression of some regulatory genes, including Hox gene expression and structure. And, quote, the loss of legs gradually or quickly in snakes or lizards no more poses a challenge to biblical biology than does the loss of functional wings in flightless insects or birds. But creationists say this, but they also group snakes and lizards in very different but functional forms. However, they claim snake forms can evolve from lizard forms, thus admitting that macroevolution is possible, the change from one kind to the other. And it just so happens that we have the fossils to show that it's highly likely, especially since said fossils were predicted by evolution and the evidence of vestigial legs. ICR is less admitting of the evidence overall, but you can see the common theme here is to attack the fossil record, not the biological possibility. But what this ignores is that snakes haven't always been like modern snakes. The details of their skulls changed radically, and they used to have legs. This is the problem with saying variation is always within kind. I mean, first of all, duh, but that depends on the definition of kind. But the amount of variation within kinds is larger than the variation between them, meaning kinds can change into other kinds, like a skinny lizard losing its legs. Snakes aren't the only ones who do this. Snakes are a kind of lizard with a particular skull type, but geckos, skinks, and other lizards all independently evolved snake-like traits while retaining their own unique skull forms. There's a similar process called carcinization, where longer-bodied crustaceans shorten their bodies to gain crab-like forms, and there's evidence that multiple lineages of crustaceans have independently converged on this particular squat shape form due solely to microevolution. For example, these so-called porcelain crabs are actually genetically and anatomically closer to lobsters, but they just have very short tails that curve under. True crabs also have short vestigial tails, but the separation is much more stark. Also notice the large antennae more typical of lobsters. How far can microevolution take a crustacean? From shrimp to lobster and lobster to crab? Who knows? Under the creationist perspective, they're only separated by the scale of shared parts, and yet those same parts can be scaled to make seemingly very different body plans. Look at how there's no stasis even just in lobsters. The fifth legs in the lobster on the left are just enlarged claws in the lobster on the right. The legs already have tiny claws, and it's just a matter of scale. One has larger antennae, one has smaller ones. Merely changing the scale of a thing can give what may seem to be our radical differences, but the point is that these changes are all that's needed to justify macroevolution. So seeing as creationists admit lizard to snake transitions are possible, why do they try to minimize the legged snake fossils? They obviously recognize that snakes can come from lizards, but they say they're different kinds, so this is an admission that macroevolution or a change in kind is indeed possible under quote-unquote creationist biology. They admit it's not impossible because the evidence is overwhelming, so they have to dispute the fossil record. It's their only move left. They also claim that legless snakes are the lowest in the strata, which is a lie. And if that were the case, reactivating existing leg genes would be no problem for any of these early snake ancestors. And as usual, the source they give is just a 20-year-old article on some pop news site. Not an original or academic source. This is literally the entire article that they cite. Creation.com is slightly more honest, at least admitting, though only implicitly, that the earliest known snakes were not confirmed to be legless, and in their work cited, they have 2 research articles about snakes with legs and a pop news site. They don't actually give us the study that they're referring to directly, so I had to track it down. Turns out, only some vertebrae and the jaws of these specimens were preserved, so we do not have data on what their bodies looked like. We don't even know if they were legless or not. Since the vast majority of fossils are from marine animals, the fact that we don't have good fossils from these indicates that they were probably terrestrial, supporting the lizard-to-snake hypothesis. Only the jaws and some vertebrae were found, and yet the creationists accept them as snakes on their jaws alone, some of them toothless. The reality is their leg status is unknown, but the fossil record shows a very clear pattern of continuously more vestigial legs as we go lower in the strata, and more vestigial sacral regions as the snake-type skulls fossils get younger and closer overall to modern snakes. That's the fossil pattern, mostly comprising obvious transitional forms, so it's more than reasonable to accept that the most basal snakes would also fit that pattern, especially since creationists agree that we can diagnose them as the same group by their skull features, in fact their jaw features alone. Why are all these features converging in the same evolutionary pattern all around the world? A flood would just mix them up completely randomly and in no particular gradient. So they actually have no case against the evidence for this happening, so they just move the goalposts to an even older ancestors. But at some deep psychological level, creationists understand that snakes and lizards are two very different but functional forms. They define them as different kinds, however they admit that one can evolve to the other. They aren't even disputing the possibility, just whether it actually happened or not, which is a question not of biology, but more of geology. There is no biological limitation that would make snake evolution impossible, and they contradict themselves promptly, moving the target range in the same article. They have to keep moving the goalposts back in time because we already have the transitional forms from lizards to snakes. These were the animals typical of the time, so the oldest known snakes most likely had legs rather than not. Once tetrapods get long enough, they don't need limbs to provide swimming power or movement power anymore, but there is very little separating these specimens other than the scale of their shared body parts. Smaller feet and longer tails and torsos are admittedly permitted by biblical creationism, but we can tell these evolved at the same time rather than from each other, so there must be a common ancestor in the form of a curved-toothed lizard. Not exactly unheard of. We just need to find them in the right time range to support the hypothesis with facts. These animals are already extremely similar to the legged snakes creationists want older specimens for, and they admit that a common ancestor between them is easily explained. So the argument is just that there isn't a clear common ancestor in the fossil record, therefore snake evolution is, quote, stymied. There were tons of longer, slender, and legged animals in this time period that evolved in many varied directions. Even mosasaurs went through a period of limb degradation just like snakes. The reason we look to mosasaurs is because we can observe that swimming lizards can become elongated like snakes and gain vestigial feet, this time for fins, so the hypothesis is that they're descended from similar populations of lizards where mosasaurs had one skull type and snake ancestors had a more exaggerated curved teeth from that skull type and separatable lower jaws, though there are also many similarities too. The loss of limbs and elongation of bodies occurred after skull divergence. Creationists want to argue that the swimming lizards and legged snakes just appeared abruptly in the fossil record. Well, if that were true, they could still diverge into mosasaurs and modern snakes with just microchanges. That's still kind-to-kind evolution. But due to skull difference, it is thought that they diverged before this point when they were still land-based animals. It's only been a few years since we found the latest four-legged snakes, so it's not like the books are closed and we haven't found anything along those lines for decades or something. But since a lot of animals are coming out of these elongated swimming lizard types who are the oldest, and right after that we see snakes with tiny legs, and then we stop seeing snakes with legs, and we start seeing snakes with vestigial or no legs, consistent with extant species, this pattern is already shown. So even though we don't have information on the bodies of the very oldest snakes, it is highly likely that they fit this pattern. It's unfortunate that God had to drown them all and we lost their data, instead of just taking them on the ark. They're extinct, so they obviously couldn't survive the flood, so why didn't they get to go on the ark? Did they run out of room or something? There is little crossover between extant species of snakes and lizards, though the main clusters are right up against each other, and some snakes are more similar to lizard skulls than other snakes. If we were to add in the transitional fossil forms, we would see just one giant cluster of reptiles without any significant morphological gaps. They are of the same kind, even by creationist methodology. This figure shows that the estimated lizard to snake transition showing only the burrowing snakes, and again these clusters are so close that the gaps between them are smaller than the variation range within the clusters themselves. The proposed transitional species is a long snake-like lizard with reduced limbs. Yes, some offshoots end up resembling the original population more than others, but they still change. In this figure, we still see lizard and snake skulls plotted on a scale that takes into account developmental age, and they are much closer in the embryonic state, as Evo Devo would predict, and the models accurately expected this pattern due to the fact that the snake skulls start off closer to lizard skulls and are modified from these lizard templates, with the models predicting a steeper slope of deviation from embryonic lizard-type skulls among the adult snakes than among adult lizards, and this is what's observed in the actual data. More mosasaur-typical skulls come from the same group of lizards as snake forms do, and in fact, which is why mosasaurs are considered to be sister groups to snakes. Not that snakes evolved from them, but rather that they likely evolved from the same population of lizards with curved teeth and long bodies. But does the fossil record actually support this? Why, yes it does. The curved tooth motif originates in lizards and is most exaggerated in snakes and monitor lizards. Again, these are only separated by microevolution. Slightly more curved teeth and slightly longer teeth are considered to be mere microevolutionary adaptation by evolution and creationists alike. If creationists are identifying these jawbone fragments as the oldest snakes to try and stymie evolution, then they should be able to see that there's a relationship between them and monitor lizard skulls as well. They have nearly identical lower jaws. Well, creationists wouldn't inconsistently apply diagnostic standards, would they? These lizards and snakes are in a proposed clade known as Toxicophora because, well, other than being reptiles, they share sharp, curved teeth coupled with sporadic venom use. Perhaps the reason the snake-like skull was a key innovation in this lizard clade is the ability for the teeth to inject venom deep into tissues rather than just to grip and tear flesh. This is a huge advantage as they can grip the prey very tightly, since the more it pulls out, the deeper the fangs go due to being backwards curving. But with poison, they also have the strategic option of striking quickly once and then hanging back to follow the prey until it dies. Gila monsters and Komodo dragons are among the few lizards that do have venom and use it, and they are closely linked to snakes. But how could such an elegant mechanism of venom injection evolve by random mutation? Well, we already know that saliva contains enzymes that break down flesh. We already know saliva glands exist. We already know proteins can evolve to have different chemical properties, sometimes destructive and toxic. We know glands can change positions and teeth can change shape. We know some compounds are only toxic when injected into blood, but harmless if ingested due to mucous membranes. So lizards already have every tool they need to microevolve venom from existing parts, including protein-producing glands, needle teeth, and immunity to their own weapon. The definition of venom, of course, being toxins that kill when injected, but not when ingested. The question is, how did the venom glands evolve to inject into the teeth like needles? Well, Gila monsters have teeth that have a groove running down the middle, leading to the hypothesis that the teeth grew to surround the venom canal. These open grooves represent a possible transitional form between venomous saliva and true injector fangs like viper snakes have, indicating that gradual coupling of the tooth and gland led to the tooth growing to surround a space where the gland can pass venom through. The range of effectiveness of these structures indicates evolution because why would God so elegantly design some fangs but half-ass others? But to address the creationist's incredulity that this could happen, let us ask if it's even possible for teeth to gradually adapt to this shape. The gums of the animal would provide the fourth wall of the tube that would allow venom to flow into bites. In vipers, the canal is closed, so the venom flows fully through the tooth, but the hole is actually elongated like the ends of the grooved Gila monster teeth are when covered by gums. But you can see that there's a seam along the line of the enclosed fangs, forming the venom canal and injection hole, showing that this process could be gradually achieved from grooves to a fully closed tooth, easily explained by minor adaptations and micro-changes. Studying how these fangs grow in vitro has conclusively shown that the fangs involve partial or full folding of the tooth to create a canal, but it also involves shaping via apoptosis, or programmed cell death, to provide scaffolding, parts used for structure die and empty out of cells, leaving a void that venom can flow through. A similar process is responsible for feather development, where the matrix around the branches die in a pattern that leaves only the feathery keratin branches. Again, I say this a lot, you can't even grow anything without death, so there must not have been any reproduction before the fall of Adam and Eve. Most body parts are shaped by processes of cell death. Cancer is stopped by programmed cell death, but death didn't exist before the fall in the garden. So what the hell? How can any biologist believe these myths are literally true? You have to literally ignore biology. The Garden of Eden would be an absurd world of overgrown cancer, overgrown microbe slime everywhere, and an absurd world of no childbirth and no developmental maturation. We can see here that the tooth cells fold over in development, much like the notochord of vertebrates. So this type of evolution is achievable through natural gradual means, as unclosed grooves are also functional. So creationists can't object to this evolution on biological or genetic grounds. The evolutionary history of these curved needle-shaped teeth opens up so many avenues for adaptation, so this clade is widely successful today with many different features and functions from the same basic structures. So by folding on itself, teeth can create canals within them, and this information and ability for organisms to grow and fold over to create tubes out of cells is already in the genome of every animal. The most primitive form of venom could simply be mixed with saliva and just enter the wound by coating the teeth or flowing into open bite wounds, but injecting it in concentrated amounts directly at the fang site is even more efficient, so mutations that cause close coupling of tooth and venom glands would be favored. Evo Devo, concerned with how evolutionary vestiges remain in developmental processes, show how tweaking of the fang palate gives us rows or clusters of fangs from the same growth regions, further showing how small changes to existing structures can give rise to seemingly new and different structures, with just the same building blocks but different arrangements, all possible with minor non-deleterious changes. Again, modification with descent explains all the differences between these skulls, and creationists know this. Only microevolutionary changes separate them, and yet they classify them as different kinds, showing they know exactly how macroevolutionary changes work, as they speak out of the other side of their mouths, saying evolution is stupid and impossible, while using evolution to explain their flood myth, and admitting that indeed it is possible, at least between snakes and lizards, which frankly is a far larger change than between humans and apes. But if you're looking for consistency in creationism, you're out of luck. So do we have examples of half lizard, half snakes in the time period? What about lizards with snake-like skulls in the target time period? Yep. The four-legged tetrapodophysis extends down into 120 million years old, and the target period is 190 to 100 million years old. Regardless of that fact, we can't find any snakes below. Regardless of the fact that we can't find any snakes below the oldest lizards, indicating that snakes came from them, we have lizard species that have snake-like skulls that are even older than the fossil snakes. Would monitor-like lizards solve this problem? Remember, the creationists specified 190 to 100 million year old time frame. This is Bavarisaurus, a true lizard which is at least 150 million years old and resembles the jaws of monitor lizards and the curved teeth of the earliest snakes. This is in the target range, and more demonstrates a transitional origin for the iguaniaclade. Their lower jaw is similar to modern pagona and ancestral iguanas with their triangle teeth, but closer to monitor lizards on the upper jaw with the curved snake-like teeth. This is a possible varanoid, aka monitor lizard ancestor, or more likely a sister of the true ancestor. And as we know, genetic mutations can put parts into new locations, so it's not impossible for this animal to move the genetic localization for its needle-like curved upper teeth to the lower jaw, and this probably represents a transitional form where it evolved triangle teeth from the curved teeth, since the curved teeth seem to be more basal in lizards than the triangle teeth are. I found multiple references to possible monitor lizard ancestors up to 180 million years old, exactly the lower limit of the target range creationists are asking for snake-like lizards in, which varanids would qualify for with their snake-like skulls, but I couldn't find any actual named specimens in this range. However, I found much older ones, like Varanopodi, who were not likely direct ancestors of the varanids, but who resemble them because they all come from the same basal reptiles that produced lizards and dinosaurs. Archaeovenator existed prior to the evolution of true lizards, so this is what the first lizards probably would have looked like. So the curved teeth seem to be present in the gene pool before any others, and snakes branch off fairly early. These skulls are dead ringers for monitor lizards and snake teeth, and Varanodon is closer to actual modern varanids both temporally and morphologically, predating the oldest snakes and demonstrating snake-like teeth. This type of morphology is what all lizards are descended from, so the curved teeth are fundamental in populations that predate the oldest snakes and lizards, showing that the monitor/snake tooth morphology is deeply nested in reptilia and much older than creationists want to let on. Creationists want us to point to the basal ophidian, a singular specimen, something that has all the shared traits of all snakes, or all toxicopherans, which has the shared traits of all snakes and all venomous lizards. And while it may be missing, we have even older reptiles that satisfy this criteria. So again, creationists are cherry-picking the gaps while ignoring the majority of the robust pattern that every specimen fits well into. Genetic evidence also strongly aligns with phylogeny based on morphology, showing that the monitor lizard clade and the true snake clade are closest genetically and morphologically, as evolution would predict.
Just as Count Dooku predicted!
That's the pattern, and there is no evidence that the pattern is broken, other than some snakes who we only have lower jaws and vertebrae for. But if creationists can say they're snakes just from some jaw fragments alone, then we should be able to assume that they fit the pattern overall. So we do have fossils in the correct order that establish that monitor lizard-like animals existed on land and in the water prior to the time that we begin to see extremely similar organisms with mosasaur-like and snake-like adaptations. Due to the fact that the earliest data we have on snake ears and skull data, it is likely that the two split on land before either went into the water because the older snakes have burrowing ears. It's quite possible that snakes could come out of either burrowing or swimming lizards, leaving snakes and mosasaurs as sisters derived from populations of monitor lizard-like reptiles, which also split into modern varanoids as well. The varanoid body plan can be modified to be different forms of lizard, yes, but also swimming lizards and legless lizards, none of which violates creationist conceptions of microevolution. Creationists admit that this is possible, they're just complaining that the fossil record doesn't fit the hypothesis, even though it does. So they have to do a bunch of lies and omissions to trick readers into believing this. Anyone can see how slight modifications of a curved-toothed lizard skull could produce snake-like skulls, and loss of limbs and elongation of the torso could produce snake-like bodies. Even creationists admit this, so they have to dispute the fossil record. It's their only play. They've already lost the argument as far as the possibility of getting new kinds from old kinds goes, since they say they're different kinds but admit their evolution from one to the other is possible. They take advantage of the fact that we don't have the shape, length, or form of the bodies of the oldest snakes, but how do creationists know these are snake jaws at all? If that's reasonable, then fossil fragments can indeed tell us what kind of animal a fossil is related to, and it's reasonable to infer that these would fit the strong fossil pattern of older snakes having more robust limbs. So, the fact that creationist ministries are recognizing these jaw and vertebral fragments as snakes actually defeats their position. In an attempt to present these as legless snakes, they end up agreeing with evidence that means that they most likely had legs, and in the time period creationists asked for, merely by identifying them as fitting the snake pattern. Would they admit it if legs were confirmed? Of course not. They just move the goalposts again. So if they were able to admit that a single jaw fragment is diagnostic of a whole snake, that means they should be able to accept that tapirs are related to horses, since they admit Mesohippus is a kind of horse and tapir skeletons are virtually identical. But no, they arbitrarily separate them. But the difference between tapir and basal horses is smaller than the difference between horse species that creationists admit are related. Creationists accept that these are all related, even though they have differing foot structures. Anyone should be able to recognize these as horses. Problem is, they have transitional feet. Why do we have horses with different toe numbers and different foot structures? Are they related? How could anyone say? We know microevolution can cause different numbers of toes and structures. None of this violates the tiny but ill-defined limits of microevolution under creationist assumptions. Creationists, for the most part, are fine with this, and you can tell their concern is just to explain away how little room there actually is on the ark, so they have to invoke evolution. Creation.com accepts that these are horses, based on comparative anatomy alone, so next time a creationist scoffs at paleontology doing the same thing, you know they're just cherry-picking. They accept that the multiple-toed horses evolved into single-toed horses, evolving from more typical mammal feet into a foot comprised of single, thicker, longer toe, good for galloping. Totally different hoof structure from common starting parts. So even creationists accept that horses evolved from the structure on the left into single-toed legs, with the only remnants being lateral splinters where metacarpals used to be. Typical creationist responses would be that it's stasis because it basically still looks like a horse, or that loss of fingers would be de-evolution. But the thing is that all through losses we get new structures and new functions. In this basal horse, a single finger still can't function as a foot, but in modern horses, it can. This requires substantial modification by creationist standards. So why can't something like this occur? What's the point where changes can no longer accumulate? By the way, this is a mutation in modern horses. According to creationists, mutations can't make anything, but mutations are actually making new parts and structures from the old, fusing them, and changing the instructions. Unless you're admitting that these parts are from an evolutionary history in which the population used to have these structures, but they're now deactivated. If you're going to make the argument that these were not evolved, you still have to admit that they're from an evolutionary past that used to have these structures, and therefore they did evolve. But to those who insist mutations can't create new structures, here's proof you're wrong. When you say that it's just repeating or activating existing information, that's precisely right, but slight changes make it appear in a new location when it's reactivated. So this is how everything evolves. The shape and location of things changes constantly, and eventually they're much different. The environment determines what changes stick, and changes can cause new structures by putting old structures in new locations. This perfectly healthy cat with thumbs is an even better example of genetic information making new structures by reshuffling existing components. So, at what point do the changes stop accumulating? At what point do accumulated microchanges equal a macro change? Creationist institutionists will accept this transitional series because of the overwhelming morphological similarity of the rest of the body. However, God can just put new feet on anything he wants, so how are they actually able to determine that they're related and not just repeated common parts? Why are they limiting God like this? Not only would this be pretty lazy design, but creationists have to make most of life evolved from shared ancestors, because they can't fit all large animals on the ark if they were all or even mostly separately created. So creationists use evolution as a crutch while denying it past a certain undefined point. This is absolutely macroevolution and a total refutation of stasis in horses, and it's accepted by creationists.
Ironic.
All to avoid calling humans apes, which they are, no matter if they're related to other apes or not, just like all birds are birds and all snakes are snakes, even though creationists also claim that there are separately created bird and snake kinds. Creationists also accept this because it features quote-unquote loss of information. However, what they don't realize is that there is new information put into the central toe and the lost toes in order to create an overall novel structure. It's not as simple as just losing DNA. We are seeing a new structure capable of supporting an animal from a single toe, new functions from old parts. How is life redesigning itself successfully, better than the old model, and all without a designer? I would need some engineering to turn my middle finger into a foot, and yet we know that nature did it on its own through mutation and selection, and creationists admit it. They can't use the excuse of genetic entropy because horses are very fit and continue to be bred to be more fit without genetic degradation. Creationists admit that horses changed form and radically changed their foot morphology, so what's to say that they've stopped now? So why couldn't tapirs be related to horses? They're shockingly close morphologically. Tapirs are far closer to basal horses than basal horses are to modern horses. If we did the creationist method of taxon correlation, these clusters would be closer to each other than their own members are to each other, proving relatedness by creationist standards between the tapir kind and the horse kind, cited as separate kinds by AIG. But since they accept the huge amount of variation in horse kind but cannot accept the absolutely negligible difference between tapir and basal horse kind, they are again working with completely inconsistent standards of what evolution can do, as usual. Creationists are forced to accept variation at the skeletal and anatomical level, but also with chromosome number. This would be a fairly major genetic change, as creationists refer to it, a mistake, but all these animals are healthy despite it, and creationists admit that this happened because they admit that these animals are related by a common ancestor. Creationists somehow accept major chromosomal translocations and mutations in horses, something they say is impossible for human evolution. Everything they say is made up just ad hoc just to refute a specific fact they don't like. Nothing is derived from a central thesis, other than God did it. And these animals are more fit than their fossil ancestors that have more toes, more fit for horsey things like racing and carrying burdens, that is. Why do they accept these huge changes within horses but not within primates? The difference between apes and humans is much smaller than the evolutionary variation creationists accept in horses. We observe mutations that are neither fatal nor deleterious and often beneficial. Copy, paste, then mutate. There is nothing any creationist can do to rebut evolution except to throw out distractions. So, in next episode, we're going to be looking at the evolution in real time of snake-like forms from other lizards. These are not true snakes, but they are snake-like, and they show many of the same adaptations as snakes. But the special thing about these legless lizards is that the transitional forms are still alive and with us today. So look forward to that, and thanks for watching, and stay skeptical, everyone.